In today's program, I intend to discuss the first bungled attempt at a diplomatic outreach extended to the Russians for a very long time, seeking to find some means of ending the war in Ukraine. The diplomatic outreach was carried out by the French, so there's good reasons to think that the Americans were also involved at some level. And as I will discuss later in this program, it was incredibly maladroit and failed spectacularly, and has merely led to a hardening, if possible, of the Russian position. Before, however, I discuss that and look at the current situation in Ukraine, provide my further military update, I'm going to discuss again the situation with Crocus City Hall. Now, in my video yesterday, I said that the latest information that had been coming from the Americans, from the Washington Post, alleging that the American side had actually specifically warned the Russians that Crocus City Hall was likely to be the venue that would be the target of the terrorist attack. Well, that information, combined with the fact that the warning covered a period of only 48 hours, would have made the Russians think that the target of any likely terrorist attack was the Shaman concert. Shaman is a well-known rock singer in Russia with very strong patriotic Russian nationalist views. Anyway, the Russians would have thought that it was the Shaman concert taking place at Crocus City Hall on the 10th of March. This is an obvious target. Shaman attracts a patriotic nationalist crowd, and it happens at a concert venue. It happened at Crocus City Hall. It falls precisely within the 48-hour period mentioned in the warning, and the Russians, absent any further warnings, might have good reason to think that with the Shaman concert having passed without incident, the danger also had passed. Well, someone within the intelligence community of the United States seems to have realized this, and seems to have realized that the information that was published to the Washington Post, the information communicated to the Washington Post that Crocus City Hall had been specifically identified as the venue given in the warning, actually undermined the American case that the Americans had provided warnings to the Russians that a terrorist incident was going to happen in Moscow, and that the Russians ignored those warnings, and that was what caused the events, the attack on 22nd March at Crocus City Hall to take place in the violent way that it did. So there's been an attempt to row back on some of the information provided and to provide further information that will repair the damage. And it's been done in a most interesting way in a briefing given to Seymour Hersh, and the result of which, by the way, has been a further article published by him. And what his informants are telling Seymour Hersh are two things. Firstly, the Washington Post article is wrong. Crocus City Hall was not identified as the venue that the terrorists were intending to attack. The Russians were not told that the attack would be specifically against Crocus City Hall. That is one. And the second is that, in fact, more warnings were indeed given to the Russians after the 48-hour period had passed, and that the Russians negligently ignored those warnings. You can almost see the attempts to repair the damage from the previous releases of information. Well, let's just unpack both of these claims. The first is whether Crocus City Hall was identified as the venue or not is something I cannot obviously comment about. I haven't seen any of the warnings the Americans claim to have given. I think in order to clarify this issue, we need to see those warnings. And I repeat my request of the two governments in question, the American and the Russian, to publish all of the warnings that the United States actually provided. The second is that the warnings that we are now told that the United States gave to the Russians after the 48-hour warning had expired, well, we've never heard about them before, and of course, no public warning was given by the US and British embassies after their original 48-hour warning expired. And that is a little strange. In fact, it's more than a little strange. It's extremely puzzling because one would assume that if after the 48-hour warning had expired, the US intelligence community still believed that there was a danger of a terrorist incident in Moscow, they would have done what they did on the 8th of March and published further warnings addressed to American and British citizens in Moscow that the danger of a terrorist attack still existed and that people, American and British citizens specifically, needed therefore to remain on their guard. Nothing like that, to my knowledge, was in fact published, with the result that if we now believe the information being given to Seymour Hersh, even as private warnings were given in secret to the Russian authorities, public warnings about possible terrorist incidents were withheld from American and British citizens in Moscow. I'm going to just make one observation about all of this before I wrap up. Firstly, I've been looking into the background of this Russian rock singer, Shaman, about whom I have known nothing before the Crocus City Hall incident took place. It turns out that he is an immensely popular rock singer in Russia. He's the second most popular rock singer in Russia. He is deeply patriotic, extremely nationalistic. I'm not suggesting that he goes beyond the level of the acceptable or the appropriate in expressing his patriotism and his nationalism, but it is absolutely clear that he strongly supports the Russian army and the special military operation that is currently taking place. Now that, to me, makes him very like other cultural figures who have been targeted by Ukrainian intelligence, and we have no doubt about that any longer. The head of the SBU, Ukraine's own intelligence service, has essentially acknowledged as much. Anyway, that makes Shaman very like other Russian cultural figures who have also been the target of attacks by agents, people working for Ukrainian intelligence. That includes Alexander Dugin, whose daughter Daria Dugina was killed in a bomb attack meant for him. It includes Zahar Prilipin, a writer very much on the nationalist end of the spectrum, who was also severely injured in a bomb attack. And of course, it includes the journalist Vladlen Tatarsky. It seems to me that Shaman, like a cultural figure, like all three of these people, falls squarely into the world of prominent cultural and literary figures in Russia who support the special military operation and who are potential targets for Ukrainian intelligence. So, given that is so, and given that despite the rather complicated explanations that we are now getting, it does seem as if the original attack, the original objective of the attack, was Shaman's concert. I think it's perhaps not so surprising that the Russians are predisposed to think that the Ukrainians had a hand in this attack. ISIS would not be particularly interested in Shaman, as far as they're concerned. He's just another rock singer. But the Ukrainians might be very interested in him indeed. And an attack on one of his concerts, the Russians might therefore think, in light of the other attacks which have happened, was likely to have a Ukrainian hand behind it. As to, as I said, the contents of the warnings, whether any further warnings after the first 48-hour warning were given, I think that can only be finally resolved if the two governments release these warnings, publish these warnings. If the two governments won't agree to do that with each other, then I think that the United States government should go ahead and do it by itself. I don't believe that that would jeopardize any intelligence sources, because we've learned from the New York Times that the US authorities actually withheld information from the warnings that would enable the Russians to trace the sources. So it doesn't seem as if sources would be compromised, just saying. And it would clarify completely what precise warnings were given, whether they did identify Crocus City Hall, and whether warnings were indeed provided after the original 48-hour warning in private to the Russians. And perhaps in that case, it would be nice to know, it would be nice to have an explanation as to why no further public warnings were provided as well. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this. Putin has been commenting, by the way, about the events at Crocus City Hall. There was earlier today a meeting of the Interior Ministry Board. I should say that Putin has been unbelievably busy over the course of today. He has both attended a meeting of the trade unions and he has attended a meeting of the Defense Ministry Board. I mean, he's been an extraordinarily busy man. Over the course of his visit to the meeting of the Interior Ministry Board, Putin did make a number of observations about the Crocus City Hall attack, as might have been expected. He spoke about the fact that the investigation is still underway, and he made certain points which suggest to me very strongly that he believes that the people who were acting in this matter, and perhaps the organization that they belong to, were actually retained under some kind of contract to carry out the attack. In other words, he's basically hinting that the Ukrainians contracted this job out to ISIS. Now, that's, as I said, his hint. He may be right, he may be completely wrong, but that's what he appears to think. And he perhaps thinks, because he also goes on to say that the contractors, whoever they were, should understand that hiring people of this kind is double-edged, that they have a capacity to act in an uncontrolled way. Perhaps what he thinks, and I'm reading his mind here, I don't know this for a fact, perhaps what he thinks is that the attack was indeed initially intended to be against the Shaman concert in Crocus City Hall on 10th of March, when that concert passed without incident because of the enhanced security. The contractors lost interest, called the whole thing off, but ISIS and its operatives in Moscow decided to carry on and carry out a strike basically on their own initiative 2 weeks later. Anyway, not an entirely impossible scenario, by the way. He does say that the investigation is still continuing and more facts will come to light. I'm not going to say more about this incident again, except again to repeat my call to the United States government to publish its warnings, or alternatively, if it does not want to publish its warnings, to do what perhaps it ought probably to have done from the outset, which is to say absolutely nothing about this affair, to stop these attempts to put the Russian government on the spot. They're starting to throw up contradictions in the Americans' own account of their own actions in this affair, or at least, if not contradictions, they're starting to create a rather complex and difficult to understand picture as to what information the Americans were indeed providing. And perhaps the best thing to do is to stay silent, let the investigation take its course. Once that investigation starts providing information and making claims, maybe that is the best point, the most appropriate point for the United States to say anything which it wants to say. In my opinion, that is the stance it should have taken from the outset, and it is most unfortunate that it didn't do so. And as I said, we see already how rushing out with statements is perhaps causing confusion and might be raising questions about the Americans' own position. Anyway, I'm going to leave this topic. I don't expect to be returning to it further. I want to see, I'm going to wait and see what the investigation comes up with, and I'm not going to say anything more until then. Now, let's now discuss what happened yesterday. And before I discussed yesterday and this call that the French Defense Minister, Monsieur Le Cornu, made to the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, and what the Russians are telling us about it, and what the French are also telling us about it, I think it's worth pointing out that this call seems to have come after certain rather curious events which took place, which may or perhaps may not be connected with this call to the Russians from the French. Now, 2 days ago, rather mysteriously and apparently completely out of the blue, President Biden contacted no less a person than President Xi Jinping of China. And we've had transcripts, or not transcripts, rather, we've had summaries of this conversation from both the Chinese and the Americans. The American readout, as usual, is extremely brief and very uninformative. The Chinese readout is long. And the Chinese readout starts with the words, "On the evening of April 2nd, President Xi Jinping spoke with US President Joe Biden on the phone at the request of the latter. Now, that is already telling us something, which is that the Americans initiated the call. As I've discussed on many occasions, it is generally unusual in a readout of this kind for one side to identify the fact that it was the other side that initiated the call. Doing so suggests that the other side is in a weaker position, and for that reason it is seen as, well, slightly disrespectful of the other side to draw attention to the fact that it sought the call and that the side that's providing the readout received it. Anyway, we then go on to read the two presidents had a candid and in-depth exchange of views on China-US relations and issues of mutual interest. Candid and in-depth. Candid can mean many things. This terminology reminds me again of those old Soviet readouts when they used to say that the sides had had a full and frank exchange of views, and that was a sign that there'd been something close to a row, or sometimes even a row. This time, it's not perhaps quite a full and frank exchange of views. We're told instead that it's a candid and in-depth exchange of views. Perhaps not a row, but hardly a friendly call. And one, as I said, that the Chinese were on the receiving end on. And we have this really very Delphic paragraph that follows almost directly. President Xi noted that his San Francisco meeting with President Biden last November opened a future-oriented San Francisco vision. Over the past few months, their officials have acted on the presidential understandings in earnest. China-US relationship is beginning to stabilize, and this is welcomed by both societies and the international community. On the other hand, the negative factors of the relationship have also been growing, and this requires attention from both sides. So, on the one hand, things appear to be getting better, but in reality, they're actually getting worse. Relations between the United States and China, on the surface, it looks like they're improving, but actually they're not improving at all. They're actually getting worse. And then there's the usual long lecture from the Chinese, from Xi Jinping to Biden, about the various things that the United States needs to keep aware of and to work on in order to put the relationship between China and the United States on a good track, with the implication all the time that the United States is not doing any of those things. And then there are the toughest comments on Taiwan that I think I have ever heard from Xi Jinping, addressed to Biden. President Xi Jinping stressed that the Taiwan question is the first red line that must not be crossed in China-US relations. In the face of Taiwan independence, separatist activities, and external encouragement and support for them, China is not going to sit on its hands. So, Xi Jinping telling Biden in the most unequivocal terms, Taiwan is a red line. China is absolutely serious about it. Don't test us on this issue. If not, you will find that we are standing ready. And then buried in this readout about this candid and in-depth exchange of views about things, we read that the two presidents also exchanged views on the Ukraine crisis, the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and other issues, which would give you the impression that the Ukraine crisis was only incidental to the whole discussion. Well, as I understand it, as I've been told by, amongst others, Sofia Midkiff, the Chinese media, the Chinese language media, and social media community are on the contrary speculating that, in fact, the primary reason why President Biden decided to call President Xi Jinping out of the blue was because he wanted to discuss the Ukraine crisis, and that much of the conversation really was about that. And the point is that we've now had that article in Politico, which I discussed yesterday, the one that tells us that Ukrainian senior officers are briefing Politico that the war in Ukraine is lost, that the $61 billion appropriation isn't going to make any difference to the outcome, that the Russians are stronger than ever, that they're more numerous than ever, that they have more equipment and material and ammunition and tanks and guns and artillery and shells and drones than ever, that their air force is massively active and flying over Ukraine and is bombing the Ukrainians and smashing their defenses, and that Ukraine cannot withstand a big Russian offensive if that offensive is launched sometime in the summer, and that one way or the other, Ukraine is clearly losing the war, and that there is nothing that the West can do to turn it round. And that was what that article in Politico said, that the only thing that might save the situation is Ukrainian grit and Russian mistakes, and that counting on Russian mistakes is not a strategy because the West itself has played out its hand. So, presumably, President Biden is being briefed about the same things. Presumably, President Biden is being briefed about the military situation in Ukraine itself. I will discuss that later in this program, but of course, briefly, we've had many Russian advances since the fall of Avdiivka. We have Kharkiv, still apparently largely without electricity, reduced to a husk. We see political tensions in Kiev themselves, apparently. Kiev itself, apparently. The situation in Ukraine is deteriorating and getting worse. So, what does the United States do in this situation? Well, they can't speak to Putin. They've ruled themselves out from doing that. So, a diplomatic outreach has to take place. There has to be some attempt made to try to persuade President Putin to call the dogs off, to try to get him to accept some kind of freeze, because that's the only thing now that apparently can save the situation, or at least save President Biden's re-election prospects, maybe. And so President Biden calls Xi Jinping and asks President Xi for his help. But, of course, if that was the American purpose, the Chinese readout suggests that the Chinese side, President Xi, was not particularly receptive. Instead of getting assurances of help from the Chinese, instead of persuading the Chinese to lean on the Russians to calm the situation down, in Ukraine, what Biden got was the usual Chinese lecture about America's transgressions, about the fact that the relationship between China and the United States is getting worse again, despite the apparent attempts at destabilization, and a very stiff warning from the Chinese not to try in Taiwan what was tried and is now failing in Ukraine. Just as Ukraine was a red line for the Russians, Taiwan is a red line for the Chinese, and just as the Russians weren't going to sit on their hands over Ukraine, China is not going to sit on its hands over Taiwan. Now, I say that, I want to stress again, the readout itself, the Chinese readout and the American readouts, don't really talk much about Ukraine. They do mention that, Ukraine was discussed, but apparently Chinese media and the Chinese social media are saying that this discussion actually ultimately was about Taiwan, about Ukraine, and the timing fits. And of course, it wasn't just China that there seems to have been some kind of an outreach to, because Secretary Blinken has apparently been to Paris. He's been giving interviews there. He gave a long interview to the French media in which he gave categorical assurances that Kiev itself would never fall, that this was absolutely ruled out, that it was impossible. And apparently some people in China are saying that what Blinken was saying was largely the same as what Biden was saying in the conversation to Xi Jinping, that what the Americans are trying now to achieve is some kind of easing off of the conflict, a freeze, if you like, one whereby the fighting stops and Kiev remains under Ukrainian control and the Ukrainians retain control of what they have at the present time. And we have some other clue, by the way, that something of a similar nature is happening, because a couple of days ago, Zelensky said to CBS News that yes, there might be negotiations, there might be discussions with the Russians based upon the Russians pulling back not to the 1991 borders, but to the status quo ante, withdrawing, in other words, to the contact line as it existed in 2022, which means the Russians returning to Ukraine, Zaporozhye and Kherson region, Mariupol, Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, all of these places that the Russians have taken. But, the Ukrainians will accept that, and they will accept that, for the moment at least, Donetsk city and Lugansk city and Crimea may remain under Russian control, though at some point, presumably, in fact, Zelensky made that fairly clear, he expects that through negotiations, through political pressure, some way or other, all of these territories will eventually be returned to Ukraine. But many are pointing out that this is the first time that Zelensky seems to have come out publicly and conceded that Ukraine might be prepared to, at least in temporarily, give up claims to the territory that was de facto under Russian control before the 24th of February 2022. In other words, the territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics as it was then. And that, coming from him, is a kind of concession. We'll come back shortly to what the Russians are saying about that, what they're saying about Zelensky's latest words. Anyway, that was said by Zelensky to the US media, and of course Blinken's comments that Kiev itself is never going to fall to the Russians was said by Blinken, importantly, to the French media. And then all that leads us to the important discussion, the really important discussion that took place yesterday between the French and the Russians. And this is the readout the Russians have provided, and it's been provided by the Russian Defense Ministry. It reads as follows. On 3rd April 2024, at the urgent request of the French side, Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, General of the Army, Sergei Shoigu, and Minister of Defense of the French Republic, Sébastien Lecornu, have held telephone talks. The French Defense Minister expressed his condolences in connection with the terrorist attack in the Crocus City Hall on 22nd March 2024. At the same time, he persistently tried to convince that Ukraine and Western countries were not involved in the terrorist attack, shifting the responsibility to ISIS. Sergei Shoigu stressed that the investigation launched in connection with the terrorist attack in the Crocus City Hall would certainly be brought to an end, and all those responsible would be punished. The Russian translation isn't here entirely clear, but what Shoigu means is that the investigation will take its course and will be allowed to continue until it reaches its conclusions. And then Shoigu finishes by saying there is information about Ukraine's trail in the organization of the terrorist attack. And then the readout, the Russian readout continues. The Kiev regime does nothing without the approval of Western curators. We trust that in this case, French special services are not involved in it, the Russian defense minister said. We trust that in this case, French special services are not involved in it. And then continuing, commenting on the Elysee Palace's statements, notice that the defense ministry doesn't refer to President Macron by name, which is interesting. Commenting on the Elysee Palace's statements about sending a French contingent to Ukraine, Sergei Shoigu pointed out that if they were implemented, it would create problems for France itself. We can be sure that the actual words were a lot more straightforward than that. And then, in some ways, the single most important paragraph. The sides express their readiness for dialogue on Ukraine. It's important to remember here that the sides are France and Russia, not Russia and Ukraine. The starting points could be based on the Istanbul Peace Initiative. Note the words the starting points and could. And then the readout finishes. Without Russia's participation, it would be pointless to hold a meeting in Geneva. Now that suggests to me a very tense and at times angry conversation. Now, firstly, note that we are told that the call was initiated by the French side and was conducted at their urgent request. Why the urgency? What is the happening that suggests a need for urgency? I'm going to suggest that the reason that there is a need for urgency is because of the latest reports that the Russian army has now reached Chasov Yar. This being seen by many people, perhaps correctly, as the remaining linchpin to the entire defense system in Donbass. We will come to what is happening near Chasov Yar later in this program. But there is now panic, there is dismay that the Russians have succeeded in advancing right up to Chasov Yar itself and might be preparing to storm that town. There are further alarms about the Russian offensive of the summer. The Americans are concerned. That's why Biden called Xi Jinping to see whether he can get Xi Jinping to lean on the Russians to pull back. And the French, at probably, I'm guessing, the request of the Americans. Remember, Blinken has been in touch with the French. He's just given an interview to French television. The French, for their part, are now calling the Russians as well. And the purpose of the call was to see whether the Russians would agree to go back to the Istanbul agreement. The agreement that was reached in Istanbul, almost reached in Istanbul, between Ukraine and Russia 2 years ago, and which the Americans and the British and the NATO side wrecked. And it's not difficult to see what happened. Shoigu said no. Istanbul is no longer the basis of an agreement. We're not prepared to go back to Istanbul as if the last 2 years never happened. We are prepared to engage in a dialogue with you. We're not prepared to speak to Ukraine. And as for Istanbul, well, some of the things that were agreed then could be the starting point for a dialogue between us, Russia, and you, France. But obviously, that's a starting point. We're not prepared to return to the agreement itself. Now, we know the conversation didn't go well. We know that there was some anger and shock on the French side after the conversation took place, because no less a person than Macron himself is now telling us as much. And I'm taking this from the Daily Telegraph. And this is what the Daily Telegraph reports Macron saying directly after this conversation between Le Cornu and Shoigu. Russia made a threatening call to France, warning that it hopes French secret agents were not involved in last month's terror attack in Moscow. That was already untrue, as we can see from the Russian readout. It was not that the Russians made a threatening call to France, it was that the French made an urgent call to Russia, and the Russians responded. But anyway, the Daily Telegraph and perhaps the French would like us to see this thing the other way round. And then we have Macron's words. The comments by the Russian side were bizarre and threatening, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, told reporters, adding that any suggestions France might have been involved in the deadly attack were ridiculous. Details of the call came as Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said that relations between Russia and NATO have now slipped to the level of direct confrontation on the 75th anniversary of NATO. And in fact, we've also had a whole series of comments now come from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And firstly, and this was said by Lavrov following a meeting he had with ambassadors from the global south, he's quoted as saying by the Russian TASS news agency, the situation is deadlocked, but we cannot be blamed for that. Our conscience is absolutely clear as we defend our truth and the interests of our people, living in lands which were founded by their ancestors, and if they want to negotiate based on justice, reality, and the balance of interests in the sphere of security, we are ready to do so at any minute. Russia has repeatedly demonstrated goodwill. It was not us who destroyed the Istanbul document, and everybody is well aware of that. It was not us who enacted laws prohibiting any talk with Ukraine, and well, it was not us who invented ultimatums a la Zelensky's formula and others. And Shoigu is also reported as saying, but when Zelensky's legitimacy was not questioned by anyone, when he was recognized by everyone, we understood the negotiations should not be conducted with him. And the conviction that this was pointless came right after the failure of the Istanbul talks in April 2022. Since then, we have understood that we should not be talking with Zelensky, but with those who permit him or forbid him to take this or that action. And Lavrov also said an honest conversation between Russia and Ukraine is possible based on new realities, based on Russia's security interests, first of all, and we are ready to ensure such agreements that will take into account our security interests and those of other countries, including Ukraine. So effectively, the Russians are now saying no return to Istanbul. Istanbul was destroyed through Western action. They're not prepared to negotiate with Zelensky himself. They no longer believe that Zelensky is capable of negotiations. And if the Western powers want to engage in a dialogue with the Russians, that dialogue can obviously be to some extent drawn on some of the things that were agreed or almost agreed in Istanbul, but there is no agreement, there is no purpose in returning to that document. And Macron clearly wasn't happy with this exchange. Neither, I suspect, was Le Cornu, who was on the receiving end. They're also deeply alarmed, clearly, by the direction that the Russians are taking. The Russian investigation into the Crocus City Hall attack is taking. They're alarmed that the Russians are apparently moving towards a position where they're going to say that Ukraine was involved in that attack and that the Western powers bear responsibility for it. And, well, we see that this outreach by the French, instead of softening the Russians, has only led to a hardening of the Russian position. And if Biden was hoping to get Xi Jinping to rein in Putin, all the indications are that Xi Jinping said no. So there we are. Now, I'm going to say straight away that if, as it seems to me must have been the case, the French attempted to get the Russians to agree to go back to Istanbul and may have floated the idea, which by the way is not in the Istanbul agreement, that the Russians pull back, to the 2022 lines, then the French and the Americans thinking in that way really are not taking into account the actual realities of the situation on the ground. And it is completely unsurprising that they got steamrolled by the Russians, which is my impression of what happened between Shoigu and Le Cornu. The right thing for the Western powers to do at this time is to do something completely different. They should go to the Russians and say, look, we see the situation in Ukraine now. What are your terms? What are your Russian terms? And of course, it's plausible that the Russians will demand more than the Western powers are prepared to concede. And it's probably as well to say at that point, straight out, that the West might not be able to concede all the demands that the Russians are making, but at least the West will have some clearer idea of what the Russians have in their minds, and then maybe the right thing to do is not to engage in phone calls, but to send an official to Moscow and to see whether some kind of discussions can actually take place there. Now, I'm going to say something further. I suspect that this conversation between Macron and between Le Cornu and Shoigu is not the first contact between the Russians and the French. I think that there have been others. I think that the French have requested that all of these conversations be conducted in private and secretly. I think the Russians have been getting increasingly exasperated by this. And I think that the Russians finally had enough and decided to publish this readout. The reason I think this is because some weeks ago, Putin was publicly saying, that there were some parties in the West which were trying to lure Russia into negotiations on unfavorable terms, that the people who were doing that were especially dangerous, and that the Russians would guard their interests and would not make concessions and would certainly not let themselves get trapped into another Minsk agreement type scenario. They would insist on cast iron guarantees in any future settlement discussion. And given the total absence of trust between the Russians and the West, Putin himself accepted that it might be difficult to meet for the West to fulfill that criteria. Now, when Putin said that before, I remember noticing those words in the various comments that he was making. I think he specifically discussed them in his interview with Dmitry Kiselyov, the Russian journalist. I said that I thought that he was probably alluding to Richard Haass and the outreach that was being made by the Council for Foreign Relations, the people from the Council for Foreign Relations in the United States. It seems to me clear now that the outreach was being made by the French, by Macron. And Putin was most unhappy about the way this outreach was being conducted. And of course, Macron going out and speaking about sending French troops to Ukraine will have soured Putin's mood even further. And I have to say, to me now, it looks as if the talk from Macron about sending troops to Ukraine was a further attempt by Macron to try to gain leverage over the Russians. And of course, all that would have done is annoy them instead. And it seems to me that some people in Washington have been quietly supporting these French overtures to Moscow. And over the last couple of days, because of the military developments, this urgent call from the French to the Russians took place, with the results we have seen. Now, I said this before, that the way to do this, given all the mistrust, is to ask the Russians first what they want. More likely than not, they will bring up the topic of the draft treaties that were presented by the Russians to the Western powers in December 2021. The West needs to be prepared for that. If it wants to come to some kind of understanding with the Russians, it needs to finally acknowledge that some kind of negotiation on that basis needs to happen seriously this time. But it's clear to me that the West still isn't ready for that. And the most anybody is thinking about is some kind of reheated Istanbul negotiation as a cover for a conflict freeze, which from a Russian point of view is obviously unacceptable. Anyway, curious lifting of the curtain has just taken place. Macron obviously embarrassed. Likely some of his NATO allies have not been made aware of all of these moves that Macron has been making, and perhaps the Americans have been making. There will be some questions about what Macron has been up to, I'm guessing from the Germans and the British and perhaps the Baltic states too. But one way or the other, the current diplomatic outreach is going nowhere. All it is doing, I suspect, is feeding Russian suspicions even more. So there we are. Now let's turn to the military situation, which is, of course, what is driving all of this. This is, as I said, what is really pushing the situation to the point where French defense ministers finally feel that they have to talk to Moscow. And the big news, actually, I think, is the fact that the Russians have now reached Chasov Yar. Yesterday, I mentioned that the Russians have captured all the fortified positions that the Ukrainians had east of Chasov Yar, at least the canal of the suburb of Chasov Yar, east of the Chasov Yar canal. It seems that the Ukrainians laid some minefields in the immediate vicinity of Chasov Yar. I said that the Russians might need time to clear the minefields, but early this morning we got reports that the Russians have reached the entry poster, the big poster, located just outside Chasov Yar, informing people who are entering the town that they are in fact entering Chasov Yar. So the Russians have now reached it. In other words, they are within meters of the first buildings of the town. It's likely that there's going to be a complex operation. The Russians also seem to be advancing on Chasov Yar from the southwest, from Ivanivska. I discussed yesterday the fact that there seems to be chaos and confusion on the part of Ukrainian troops located east of the canal, And there are some reports today that the Ukrainians are pulling troops out of the eastern suburb of Chasov Yar across the canal towards the main part of Chasov Yar, which is to the west of the canal. And it's possible, though I have to say it would be contrary to what they usually do, that the Ukrainians now understand that this eastern suburb of Chasov Yar is undefendable and that they're planning to pull all their forces east of the Chasov Yar canal and to abandon this particular suburb of Chasov Yar to the Russians. I am now confident that once this eastern suburb of Chasov Yar is captured, the Russians will themselves cross the canal and advance and work to capture Chasov Yar itself. And when they do that, they will be in possession of a town on the high ground, which is at the hub of the various railway and road networks. And the way will be relatively open to them to move on towards Konstantinovka, which is some way to the west, but on lower ground, and beyond Konstantinovka to Kramatorsk. So I think this is the big decisive event of the last couple of days. There's been a lot of military activity by the Russians in other places as well. The Russians seem to be making now significant headway in the Siversk direction. And interestingly, they're attacking from two directions. Firstly, they're attacking from the northeast, pushing eastwards, gradually encircling this obliterated village of Belogorovka, the only part of Lugansk region which remains under Ukrainian control. But as I discussed yesterday, I think that is this advance eastwards is the real battle of Belogorovka, which is only now starting. If the Russians are able to continue their advance, the Ukrainian garrison in Belogorovka will be cut off, and it's much more likely that the Ukrainian troops in Belogorovka, who are apparently paratroopers from the 81st Air Mobile Brigade, that they will have to be pulled out of Belogorovka. And there were reports, lots of reports, yesterday evening and early this morning, of intense Ukrainian counterattacks to try to stop or slow down or drive back this Russian advance southeast of Belogorovka, and that they'd all failed. And there are reports that the 81st Air Mobile Brigade, which has been in continuous action for weeks now, was defeated and has suffered significant loss. And the Russians also appear to be advancing towards Siversk from the south. Reports that they're moving up the railways towards Siversk, in the process of capturing another village called Razdorovka, again probably getting the name of it wrong, and that they're fighting to capture a railway station at a village called Vremka, again south of Siversk. But anyway, the fighting around Siversk looks very intense. I remember back in 2022, after the battles of which ended with the Russian capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, there was some discussion about whether the Russians would go first for Bakhmut or for Siversk. Well, Bakhmut, of course, was captured in May last year. The Russians, therefore, are in a position to advance towards Siversk. But importantly, they seem to be moving towards both Siversk and Chasov Yar, the town west of Bakhmut, simultaneously. And if Siversk falls, if the Russians eventually capture Siversk, as I've said, that opens the way up for the Russians to renew their advance across the Zherebets River to Liman and perhaps towards Kupiansk as well, and towards Izium. And with the Russians, if they capture Chasov Yar, able to strike at Kramatorsk, the Russians, through the capture of Siversk and these other places, would be able to attack the city at the northern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which is, of course, Slavyansk. So it looks like the final big battle for Donbass is being prepared. The ground is being shaped in order to achieve it. And in the meantime, we're getting news that the battle preparing for the fall of southern Donbass is also underway. Now, I discussed extensively in recent programs the importance of the fighting and the capture of the two big villages, Novomikhailivka and, well, not a village, the town of Pervomaisky. And there were reports at one point that the Ukrainians had pulled out of Pervomaisky. There was what looked like reliable reports that the Russians had captured Novomikhailivka. Well, again, as the Ukrainians always do, they reinforce failure. They seem to have sent more troops into Pervomaisky. They seem to have carried out more counterattacks, trying to dislodge the Russians from positions that they've captured in Pervomaisky. All the reports suggest that those attacks have been unsuccessful. It is looking increasingly as if the Ukrainians are digging themselves into a deeper hole in Pervomaisky, where it looks like the Russians are gradually working to encircle them. It's the repeat here, to a great extent, of what happened in Avdiivka back in February. And the same seems to be true in Novomikhailivka. Reports that the Russians had captured Novomikhailivka, contradicted by new reports that the Ukrainians rushed reinforcements to try to hold the western part of Novomikhailivka, even as the Russians are to the east and north and west of these positions, and in fact hold this remaining small part of Novomikhailivka in a vice. And the Russians not only are able now to strike at the Ukrainian troops still clinging on in these outlying places of Novomikhailivka, but they're also able to launch attacks on the Ukrainians in a village called Paraskovyevke, which is just west of Novomikhailivka, and even on another village, also confusingly called Konstantinovka, which lies to the west of Paraskovyevke and to the east, by the way, of the town of Kurakhovo. So, once again, the Ukrainians reinforcing failure and rushing troops, rushing reinforcements into what increasingly looks like an encirclement. In Avdiivka, these tactics apparently led to something like 1,000 Ukrainian troops being taken prisoner by the Russians. I would not be at all surprised if in both Pervomaisky and Novomikhailivka we see this all repeat itself. But it's clear that President Zelensky and his new commander, General Syrskyi, still find it very difficult to accept retreats, even from completely undefendable positions. They insist on holding every millimeter of ground to the bitterest end, and they're prepared to sacrifice lives to do that. and we're likely to see more lives sacrificed pointlessly in Pervomaisky and Novomikhailivka to buy the Ukrainians perhaps a few more days. So that, it seems to me, is the overall situation on the battlefronts today. An operational crisis for the Ukrainians in Chasov Yar, the importance of which cannot be underestimated. I think Chasov Yar is now gaining an importance in this war, only slightly below that of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. Chasov Yar falls, the Western powers will be face to face with the reality that the Battle of Donbass is about to end in a Russian victory. And the Ukrainians desperately trying to stop, to hold back the Russian advance in Pervomaisky and Novomikhailivka. In both cases, ultimately, because they're worried about the collapse in places like Krasnogorovka and Kurakovo, but also because they fear ultimately that once that collapse in these places comes, their other fortress in southern Donbass, Vugleda, will also collapse, and that they will have lost the Battle of Donbass in this area as well. So, bitter fighting, but the outcome in no sort of doubt. The Russians pushing forward and giving the French, when they call them, a piece of their mind, and, well, brushing off French proposals for a conflict freeze or a possible return to Istanbul. Let me repeat again, in this kind of situation, some kind of negotiation with the Russians is an absolutely mandatory requirement for the Western powers to engage in. The alternative is total defeat in Ukraine. There's been an article in Bloomberg now telling us that the Russians have comprehensively won the arms race in terms of re-equipping troops, that re-equipping their army in the conflict zone. The West has not been able to keep up with the Russians here. We've had more news, by the way, about the situation with the Russian economy this year. The Russian Economics Ministry says that GDP growth in February was 7.7%. Gives one a sense of the scale of the industrial and investment surge. We've also had indications that in March, growth has been in Russia, if possible, higher still. And Putin, by the way, has gone out of his way in comments that he has made in a meeting with the trade unions in Moscow to deny the fact that, to deny the claim that Russia is any kind of war economy. He said that those claims are simply not true and that this is not the direction that Russia is taking. His exact words, according to TASS, were these: despite all the current difficulties, we are not transferring the economy to a wartime regime. It is not happening. Yes, we are focusing efforts, concentrating administrative and financial resources to develop defense sectors of production, but we are not shifting the economy to a war track. The economy everything is sufficiently balanced. All sectors of the economy are interconnected. The defense industry is closely linked to other sectors of production, and the rise in the level of salaries related to increased purchasing power of the population influences light industry, the food industry, and agriculture. All things are intertwined. He's quoting here or alluding here to a comment that is often attributed to Lenin. All things are connected. Anyway, there we go. So the Russians are not under any pressure to negotiate. They are winning the war. They know they're winning the war. The West, if it wants to avoid a spectacular geopolitical disaster, which is what a defeat in Ukraine would be, in its own interests, needs to talk to the Russians. But coming up with half-baked proposals, such as a return to Istanbul or a conflict freeze, is going to get nowhere. It is only going to annoy the Russians even more. The logical and right thing to do is to ask the Russians, what is it exactly in Ukraine that they want to achieve, and see whether it is possible, might not be possible, but see whether it is possible for the West to meet them halfway. I would have thought that is basic, obvious diplomacy, but it seems with the West today, it is not. Well, this is where I end my program today. As I said, I expect that I will not be returning to the topic of Crocus City Hall and the attack there until we get more information from the investigative committee, the Russian investigative committee that is conducting the investigation. It's interesting that the Western powers are now trying to engage in some kind of diplomatic outreach. Possibly Biden's call to Xi Jinping was such an attempt. I completely concur with Professor Sachs's view, discussed in a recent article that he's written on the art of diplomacy and discussed with us on the Duran in a live stream, that if there is going to be an outreach to the Russians, it needs to be done by the Americans, and the person who needs to lead it is the President of the United States, President Biden himself. And the way he does that is by calling Putin, calling Xi Jinping to discuss the conflict in Ukraine, if that is what happened, is calling the wrong person, and getting the French defense minister, the luckless French defense minister, to do the job for him is straightforwardly a huge mistake. So President Biden needs to pick up the phone to Putin, talk to Putin himself, ask Putin what he wants, and perhaps something might, in that case, start to happen. This way to conduct negotiations is not going to work. But anyway, enough from me today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You will find all sorts of amazing things there. You notice that I'm wearing a no reverse gear top, for example. You can find that on our shop too. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.